Boardroom Bound, episode 104. How can you influence others in the boardroom? With Scott Baldwin.
I think in a nutshell, if I could frame it in a very straightforward way, it would be do the prep and be committed to having a good level of preparation before you go into the meeting, and have it, and combined with that is determining what is that small number of really great questions that you're going to have in your quiver as you go in, prepared and comfortable that you're not only prepared for the meeting, but you're ready to contribute.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. And in today's episode, we're speaking with Scott Baldwin. He is the CEO of directorprep.com, and this is a wonderful place for new and aspiring directors to very quickly get to grips with how you be successful in the boardroom. Scott has fabulous resources like a 4-step prep framework. When you think about maybe the 1,000 pages of documents you have to read for a board meeting, how do you get through that? A curated questions database, the type of information you're going to want to be able to ask and answer in the boardroom. So much to share in addition to that about how his personal board journey prepared him and the stories along the way about how he got to be basically a guru in the boardroom space. So let's jump into the show. Scott Baldwin, welcome to the Boardroom Bound Podcast.
Hey, Alexander. Great to be here.
Well, you and I had a chat before this, and there's a lot of similarities. Two governance geeks had a really good phone call conversation, just enjoying the different stuff that we get to talk about. So I'm glad to have you on the show today and excited to share what you're doing. And I know there's a lot of benefits that some of our audience members will be able to pick up from this. But before we get into that fun stuff, let's just start with some scene setting. It's very important for audience to understand the background, where you've been, how you got to where you are today, especially leading directorprep.com. And also, I'd love to hear about some of your early board experience.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity. And to your show, if I might just at the start, I'm use an old talk radio phrase. I'm a long-time listener and a first-time caller. I think I've been listening to your podcast since about the second or third episode, and now you're approaching a larger number, and it's just great to be here with you. I started my board career in the later part of the last century, early 2000, was getting into volunteer work on boards, and I pursued a certification and became a certified corporate director here in Canada, where I'm from, in 2007, and that's from the Institute of Corporate Directors. I've always had an entrepreneurial bend in my professional career. I've been an owner of a boutique advisory firm for over 20 years. And about the last 15 or so has been a real focus on working with boards and board clients and individual directors and helping them be as effective as they can possibly be. And at the same time, I get the greatest satisfaction serving on boards and putting that director certification to use. And that's a wide range of private company, government crown agencies, large nonprofits, and some smaller nonprofits as well.
So, Scott, you mentioned a lot of things there, which is great. We'll use those all in this episode. But if we start with a certified corporate director in Canada. Now, we've talked about on the show different entities, NACD in America. We've talked about ones in the UK and Australia, New Zealand, and other places. And some of them are incredibly high quality. You get a lot of learning from it. I know you were pretty early days with the Canadian institution. I'd love if you could just expand upon it for our audience. Share what it's like going through this, what you learned from it, perhaps what it's mean for you to be able to have that stamp on your resume as you're going forward for opportunities, because I'm a big believer in education, and I'd love to see all of our audience participating, whatever the right organization is for them.
Well, we are too. I mean, continuous learning is a core value of our company and myself personally, and I do gravitate toward it. And my interest in serving and working with boards When I learned of the certification program of the ICD, which is the Institute of Corporate Directors, I just gravitated toward it immediately, and I was so glad that I did. And I happened to take it in Toronto. It's now offered in my home city of Winnipeg, Canada, and is offered. They partner with business schools, the leading business schools across the country, to have that delivery. And the real benefit is being in the room with many of these seasoned directors who do recognize the opportunity to give back a little bit if you're not as much of a veteran as they are. And I benefited very much so from that experience. As I mentioned, it was 2007 when I started. And up here, it's kind of funny because right after there's a federal election, and if the government changes hands, there's some cabinet ministers that are now looking for work. There's often one or two in your class, which makes for an interesting environment. But you learn the standards. You learn, now director certification at that level. If you want to be on a publicly traded board, those are really, it's table stakes. And there's a requirement that you have board experience before you're accepted into the program. Here in Canada, it's run through the Rotman Business School at the University of Toronto, and their peer group are the Ivy League schools out east, and the faculty is just incredibly talented. Edutainment, I think, is how they brand it sometimes. But it's that interaction with your peers and mates in the class that really add value to the work that you do.
And so when you are out there now looking for opportunities, so many of our members aspire to not just a one board position, but ideally a portfolio of board roles. They're thinking that's exactly what I'd like to do someday. And there's probably a combination of public and private and nonprofit. Having that stamp on your resume, I don't know that it necessarily gets you the interview, but I feel like when you're the final slate of candidates, if you don't have that, because probably everybody else does, it's an easy way to get knocked down. Is that the way you think about it?
It can be a differentiator. I mean, you actually hope that it is because it's a pretty good investment. In my case, I paid for it and invested myself. Many people who are in the class, they've had a company or a board fund it, which is great. And all the power to them for doing that. But in my advisory work, I was able to make use of a lot of the training and development that I got in the certification program as well, and share that and give that back to many of the clients that I was working with, whether they were private company boards, or I have done a lot of work with large nonprofits as well. And it's really trying to help. They say sometimes that with the Carver folks talk about sometimes the biggest challenge in working with volunteers is their desire to help. And I don't mean to be flip about that, but it's that understanding where that bright line is between the work of governance and the board and inside the operations. And the story I like to tell to try and help illustrate that a little bit is, imagine you own a restaurant. And you're the owner of the restaurant, and let's say it's a 3-star Michelin level restaurant. You've got a great executive chef. Well, as the owner of the restaurant, if you ever went into the kitchen and wanted to add salt to the soup, I don't think you'd have a chef very much longer. And that's really that bright line between governance and operations. And that's what a lot of gets drilled down into with the certification, the base education programs. And whether it's with the Certifying Institute in Canada, the NACD in the States now has programs, and there's global institutes around the world that have just tremendous levels of training. And there's also an organization out of DC for the nonprofit world, BoardSource, which I'm sure you're probably familiar with. Mm-hmm. And I just think they offer tremendous value to people in the nonprofit world at a very affordable price.
And yet, even with all the right training in the world, it's so hard because you probably were a seasoned executive that delivered, and that's how you built that career, and you get to the top, and now you're in the boards and you realize, like, oh no, it's nose in, fingers out. Like, I'm not supposed to have my finger on the pulse of the day-to-day business. That's the management team. And there's a fine line between how much to be involved in the board meeting. If we went back several decades ago, if the board asked more than 3 questions, well, you're crossing the line. You're in the management space now. And that can vary based upon industry, on whether you're in a crisis or not, how much a board should be involved. That's not necessarily an easy thing for someone to figure out. So I know you were talking earlier in the show about a lot of the board coaching that you do, not only for organizations, but for individuals. How do you help an individual figure out how to bring the best of themselves into the boardroom and to do it in a boardsy way, if I call it that?
I think in a nutshell, if I could frame it in a very straightforward way, it would be do the prep. And be committed to having a good level of preparation before you go into the meeting, and have it. And combined with that is determining what is that small number of really great questions that you're going to have in your quiver as you go in, prepared and comfortable, that you're not only prepared for the meeting, but you're ready to contribute, and that you've taken the time to properly review the material that's come in, give yourself enough time to prepare properly, to review that material, to determine where in the agenda can you add the most value, because we all know what it's like to be in a boardroom with someone who feels like they have to speak on every single topic. There are going to be those topics for which you know that you can add the greatest amount of value. So preparation and having some good questions going in definitely helps.
Well, to follow up on your point about preparation, I think we've also all been in meetings where some people perhaps are not as prepared as they could be and are either catching up or not adding value we thought they would because they weren't prepared for it. Fortunately, what we don't hear anymore is what you'd hear a couple of decades ago. Like the beginning of a board meeting, you hear a bunch of ripped paper, which is people opening the board packs that were mailed to them. That doesn't happen anymore because now you might have it on an iPad, right? So it wouldn't be revealed in the same way.
Well, the binder cracking open for the first time, but that's a dead giveaway. But so the fact that these portals now have a very base level of sophistication that boards that I've worked with, they pay attention to when that board package gets opened because they can tell online. They can tell on the electronic in the back end of their portal and then at their site when the director opened up that package and when they were working with it. And I am aware of one case where there's a medical organization with physicians where a doctor was asked to step off the board because there was a consistent pattern of opening up the board package an hour before the meeting.
Wow.
And you can track that. And you got to be upfront about it. To be fair, during your orientation, let people know that you have that capacity to do. But more so, you're really encouraging people to spend the time and invest because in many of those cases, you're getting paid to be there. And it's important that you do good work.
And it is a massive time commitment. I'd love to hear about sort of your coaching, advising to people around this, but it's not something for the faint of heart. It's the sort of situation where they don't allow overboarding for a reason because you need to be giving enough time and energy to it. And it depends maybe whether you still have a day job in the C-suite or you're retired and you have a portfolio of board roles. But you hear different figures, maybe 300 hours a year, something like that. These are large amounts of time, and it varies again depending, maybe if you're in the middle of a crisis, that is easily doubled, tripled, quadrupled, depending on your industry, et cetera. Maybe you have a CEO who steps down, you have to do the succession planning. It can be pretty dramatic. When organizations as well as individuals are coming to you to talk about the coaching and advising, how do you help them figure out what's the right model and how to find the right people?
I like to think of organizing their board structure and the composition of the board aligned with the mission of the organization. One phrase I picked up a number of years ago was a mission-based strategic board. My preference is to work with boards that have a more strategic focus. There's a number of different governance models, Alexander, as you know, from a hands-on working board, your local community club or church group or daycare or whatever that might be, where there is no staff or maybe limited number of staff, and the board members have to get in there and do the work. But in the course of running your meeting, maybe it's organizing your agenda items between the governance items and the operational items, knowing what hat you're wearing at the time. That can be helpful, and some guidance in that way just to reinforce that and can make a difference. And the power of that agenda is one tool that every board has to ensure that your most strategic items are at the top of the agenda and getting the most amount of airtime. And I think that's a pretty common best practice now with boards who really want to focus on being strategic and not being in the kitchen and crossing that line into operations.
Well, I think you've probably, over your years of advising and working with people, come across a lot of situations that you felt, I think we could do some mass education around this. We could really help people prepare. And, I'd love to hear, I imagine this was part of it. What led you to start up directorprep.com and what you're going about doing there?
Well, thank you for the question. I appreciate it. Director Prep, a bit of a labor of love. We've been working at it now for a couple of years and now launched. And it's here because a new aspiring or up-and-coming director just might need a little encouragement and support to get started or perhaps refine, what they already do in the boardroom. Our work is to help directors prepare for board meetings so that they can collaborate, contribute, and influence decisions. So as it relates to maybe the larger director institutes, et cetera, I mean, we're very complimentary to the work that they do, and we might even be a bit of a feeder system for those directors when they feel the confidence and to go for a little bit more advanced education. When I meet a new director, the very first thing they usually ask is, okay, oh, great, I'm on this board. Now what?
Yeah. What
am I supposed to do? How do I go all through those pre-read files that just arrived on my laptop? What's important and what's not? What's the fastest and most effective way to prepare? Where do I start? I get it. We've all been there, and it can be overwhelming, but it doesn't have to be that way. If you have a method, and we've created what we call a prep framework, a 4-step process to try and help people put a little bit of not so much rigor, but just a systematic way to get ready for that meeting. They can save time, but they can also prepare well and feel like they have some self-confidence when they go into the boardroom. So our focus very much is that new and aspiring director, because while there are a few hundred really good paid director positions in North America and around the world, maybe if you've limited 1,000 number, there are tens of thousands of directors volunteering in nonprofits who do not get much in the way of director education and support. And these are vitally important organizations. And if we can do something in a very cost-effective way to help these directors do a better job at what they do, then we're hopeful they can do a better job for their organizations. I think with the ICD up here in Canada, their tagline, I think, is appropriate, where they talk about better directors, better boards, better business. Mm-hmm. And it does apply. And we're just trying to not give back sounds a little cliche, but it is part of that. We just want to be able to have an online hub for directors to get ready for their board meetings. And we have a curated questions database that can help them. And I think that's actually a tool that's going to be good for a lot of directors, where I had a client, it's all his fault actually, he said to me one time, he picked up his smartphone and he said, wouldn't it be great if I was getting ready for a board meeting and I could just look at this phone and get some questions? Mm. And that prompted a bit of an effort to try and put this together. And it's good to go. And we call it the Director Prep Questions app. And we're quite happy with it.
And we played around with it before this call, and I thought it was fantastic. And I was envisioning what it's like to be a new director and how useful it could be. And I was sharing the story that I'm on the board of one of the 30 largest YMCAs in the U.S., and they have a robust onboarding process, which is not typical of most nonprofits, but they're a sizable organization. So I'm proud that they do have that. But for many directors, you have no idea what you got yourself into. You walk into the room, and again, it can vary based on the culture of the board, but sometimes boards do that intentionally. I have a friend who is the chair of multiple public boards, and he said to me, he goes, I insist that one of our board members is always brand new, has never had a board role before. And I was quizzing him about that, and he said, look, so we might have 1,000 pages for our board meetings, right? I know exactly what I need to read every time. I just need to read the changes. In fact, I force them to give me the document that just shows the changes. I only need to read the changes. I've been on the board for years. I know everything else in there. But I want someone who is brand new, who has never seen this stuff. I know they will read every page in the 1,000 pages, and they might catch something we didn't before. That's a very strategic approach from him, and I commend him for that. I've never heard it described like that before, but what a challenge for the new board member. And so I think having something like your system in place is very valuable.
Well, as you mentioned, kudos to those boards that have embraced the importance of having an effective onboarding program. And it's even out of 10 orientations that I'll come across, I might come across 3 or 4. And the rest tend to be 2 hours over coffee with the CEO to learn what a major cardiac hospital is all about. They're recruiting smart people to be on these boards, but you really need them to contribute quickly, especially today. You need them to be able to hit the ground running in some fashion. And while I agree, we need to take a look at their first year of board service as being a year of orientation. We do need them to feel comfortable to be able to contribute faster than they do sometimes when there's very little in the way of orientation. And to that matter, we've actually now developed an online course called a DIY onboarding program, where we're putting the accountability and the responsibility on the director to take it upon themselves to get the information that they need so that they can be feeling comfortable in that boardroom so they can get up to speed quicker.
It's interesting because I've heard different experiences from different board members, and Cheryl Batchelder was on our show before, and she shared how on her first board, it was very collegial. It was a wonderful environment where the other board members recognized they needed to put their arms around the new members, really dragged them close and gave them the skill sets and the mentoring that they needed, and which is a wonderful experience. That is not the norm at every board. And if,
now, what about you, Alexander? Have you been on a board that had a board buddy system?
I think I haven't found one where they sort of came to me and said, buddy, I think I was smart enough to go and say, I need some help and let me go find some good people here who can help me. So I have made some buddies, but I haven't had one that has a buddy system.
Oh, interesting. When I was taking that ICD Director Education program back in 2007, it was I had a wonderful experience. There was a senior director in the room, and he was health and safety officer for a global mining company, a name you'd recognize, and it was after the first day. It was the program was 4 3-day weekends. And it was after the first Friday, and it was toward the end of the day, 5 o'clock. People are starting to go their own way, and he just walked over to me and he said, "You and I are going for dinner." Hello, hi. No, come on, let's go for dinner. We were from out of town, and I ended up spending a lot of time with this gentleman because he just recognized that this guy needed a bit of help. And the first thing over dinner he wanted to do was grill me on what my elevator pitch was, and it was totally enlightening. But I was very, very appreciative. We didn't establish a formal board buddy system, but over the course of that certification program over those 4 weekends, we certainly spent some time together and stayed in touch afterward. He lives in Houston, and that's the kind of thing that when you're orienting a new director, whether it's a formal board buddy system or not, or something that casually develops over coffee or during the breaks, if you're that veteran director who can share some of the wisdom that you've learned along the way, I think it's a real advantage to that new director to get them up to speed as quick as you can. Why do things work the way they do? Because they may be hesitant to ask that question in front of everybody.
Yeah, it's interesting when you think about starting a new job, not in a board role, but let's say you're in the management type role. There's a period of time in the beginning when you can ask any question you want, including like, why do we do it this way? How does it work? And everyone accepts that that's a good thing to be able to do. You really don't get that leeway in the boardroom. And that's partly because you don't meet very often. You've got essential, critical decisions to make on a regular basis, and you've got to move pretty quickly. So if you, Scott, so some of the organizations that you're advising that are looking for help, if you could devise, say, the perfect onboarding type system, what else would you add from what we haven't yet discussed today?
Well, I think a great program, would have the fundamentals, and starting with, we call it board building blocks, and it's everything about, let's get an understanding of the history of the organization. We recently we have a blog that we write. It comes out every Sunday morning called The Savvy Director. And we did one recently on organizational history and understanding history and the values of an organization, how they came about. And sometimes that can go a long way to helping people understand how decisions are made in a particular culture of an organization. So those building blocks, which include the history, the culture of the organization, how the board works, the structure, the standard things you'd find in the governance manual, that's great. Those are the fundamentals. Let's get them done. But then our middle section, which we refer to as taking charge, are the things that you can do as an individual director. And it could include things like having that board buddy system, determining who it is that you want to meet with, and maybe having a coffee between board meetings to ask the questions you want to have answered. And we used to like to say around here, stay curious, and just find out. And sometimes those questions can be asked, and people will give you, especially at the beginning, the time of day to try and answer your questions and get you up to speed. And so that's important. So just circling back, there's the things that are organizational and historical, and then there's things that you can do as an individual. And if you need it, the third tranche would be if you need, like governance at a glance. If you don't have the baseline governance skills, because sometimes, especially in our nonprofit world, it's great to have somebody with a pulse. But let's train them up a little bit. Let's try and get the basics and the fundamentals. And hopefully, it's an organization that can afford to send you to some baseline curriculum and courses to get educated and get trained up a little bit. But if not, if it's something, and this is actually I just thought this, something I look for sometimes is the director who will not think twice about pulling out their own credit card to take a course versus the director who, I'd like to take that course, but if the board's not going to pay for it, I'm not going to take it. And that tells me a lot about their commitment to continuous learning and their values that way to want to be better at what they do. And I look for that in some ways. And sure, it's great if the board has budgeted enough to to invest in their directors, and hopefully they do. But some simply don't. But there are great organizations. We mentioned BoardSource earlier, and others where, I've been a member of that organization since day one. And I think my individual membership's like $135 US a year. And that's just tremendous value.
Well, we've actually talked about before the show started today that there are great organizations all around the world, that there's so much to learn from. And these days, so much content is shared. Some of it is you have to pay to get, but there's so much to learn from. I hope this is an example for some people. Like, we intend to give this away for free to educate people, right? We get to tap into great minds like Scott to bring that to you today. What are some of the other places that you go to get great value, Scott?
One place I go, there's an affiliation of director institutes around the world. It's called, the acronym is GNDI, which stands for Global Network of Director Institutes. And all of the leading country institutes around the world are part of this affiliated network. So it would be the NACD in America, the ICD in Canada, the Australian Company Directors Organization, New Zealand. There's one from Russia. There's one from Mexico. Singapore, Asia, China, all the different countries are part of this organization, and they make their materials and their trainings available to members of the other organizations at a reduced fee. And when I was involved with the ICD in Canada, I was a chapter chair of our local organization. That's when this thing came about. They called it a passport, where you can go, and if there's a course in New Zealand or Australia or in America that you want to take, you can get access to it. So we're not limited. It's a global economy, global world where our education and training, if you live in America, you can take a course from an American organization. If you see one in Canada you like, or another country, you can go do that. And GNDI is the acronym, again, Global Network of Director Institutes. On our resources page at directorprep.com, we have the web links and the logos for all of those organizations on one page. So if folks are interested in that, just check that out and click away and should shop to your heart's content. There's some really, really good work going on around the world, and it's fun to watch, the emergence of these director institutes in South Africa and Croatia and Malaysia and all around, and seeing what these organizations have in common. And to me, that's aspirational. And we talk about the savvy director. It's striving to maybe someday be recognized. Someone might think of you that way. It's not a degree. It's not a certification that you get, but you know what that director is like, that one director who sits in the boardroom and is maybe listening, and the discussion's not really going anywhere, but they have that capacity to ask that one very powerful question that kickstarts the conversation and gets resolution to an issue and gets you to a decision. That's the savvy director that I think of, and that's a savvy director I'd like to be someday.
Well, I think that's good inspiration, because if some of our audience, and I think many of them are aspiring to a portfolio of board roles, the board member is always learning. They're always growing, developing, whether you're taking those courses, whether you have a pile of books on your bedside table because you're trying to, whether it's stay abreast of new technology or understand new leadership techniques, whatever it might be. You're always trying to bring your best self to the boardroom. And I imagine when you take on a new board role, it should be probably a 50-50 split between things that you can add tremendous value and you have an expertise, but also opportunities for you to grow and develop, because that's what's interesting. That's what I find. It still gives me the energy and wants me to come back and be involved in doing it. And I assume it's the same for you.
Well, and good for you. I think the future of the boardroom is really bright, and there's going to be generational change, and many of the vets are going to rotate off their board positions, and it's good to see some of the mentoring that's going on. The establishment of some wonderful businesses, that are dedicated to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Women on Boards, Athena Alliance. These organizations are having impact, and something like ESG, it's just not a fad, and it's not going to go away. Mm-hmm. And through my lens, you can just tell by the number of consulting firms that are jockeying for advisory positions with their clients to advise on ESG. So directors that can come to the table with this new knowledge and wisdom are going to have a tremendous opportunity. I think it's just going to refresh our boards, and just coming back to that tagline, better directors, better boards, better business. And I think it's, in Canada, we like to say a better country. And I think it really does make a difference. And we need to get young people excited about serving on whatever type of board lights them up. And they don't all have to be pursuing a paid board gig to have an impact on the community. There's a Governance Innovation Center at the University of Toronto called the David and Sharon Johnston Center for Governance Innovation. David Johnston was our Governor General of our country, and a tremendous educator, was President, CEO of, I think it was Waterloo University in Ontario. And their whole focus is on governance innovation and getting young people invested and wanting to serve on boards. And it's time. I mean, the veterans are starting to roll off, whether it's age limits, et cetera, and trying to get people excited about it and learning about it. And that's where I think you see that, you're a university educator, and I think you're probably seeing it as well. And I just think the future's bright.
Well, I would agree that, I don't know if I'm go as far as called a Pollyanna, but I do think the future is bright. And, Scott, as I think about how to wrap this up with a nice bow, I guess I'd ask what your parting advice you might have is for new and aspiring board members.
Start early. Get on a nonprofit board, figure things out, get the best training you can afford. I think there's plenty of good training available online, where some of it's free, some of it's just in a book. There's a great book called Governance Solutions by David and Deborah Brown that it's like a soup to nuts. It's a little dense, but it's a tremendous book that I've come across for any director to learn what's going on, and a newbie director could dive right in on that. Pursue any of the certifications available and keep going. Never stop learning. Stay curious. And from my perspective, do the prep. We like to savor the prep, the benefits of it, full stop. So have a system to get into your head on how to approach the board material, prepare your questions, and let's think of we instead of me. And as you get started earlier, get experience on those nonprofit boards. You get a sense of boardroom dynamics and how to handle yourself in the room, and you realize that someone once said to me, you can tell within 30 seconds the director who's had governance training as soon as they open their mouth, because the perspective will be more about the whole as opposed to their own individual interest or maybe a constituency that they represent. And for new and inspiring, get started, get some experience, and stay committed to it.
Well, great advice. Well, Scott, we were delighted to have you on the show today. Thank you for sharing your insights and helping all of us to be boardroom bound.
Thank you so much. It's an honor. Thank you.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Scott Baldwin. I love some of the resources that he has built. And for our audience of new and aspiring directors, these are going to be incredibly helpful. Think about a 4-step prep framework for how you can be successful in getting through all of that material before a board meeting. Or his curated list of questions. That database is going to be so useful to think about what are the right things that I should focus on. Now remember, if you head over to podcast.gordon.edu, you will find links to all of today's resources. And please know that the Boardroom Bound team and I are so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any of the high-quality content that we're bringing to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.